Around the year 500 AD, a single battle on a nameless British hilltop stopped a 50-year invasion dead in its tracks. The man who led the final charge would one day be called King Arthur. But the real story, the one buried beneath centuries of legend, is nothing like the fairy tale you were told. There was no magical sword, no round table, no shining kingdom called Camelot. There was a hill, there was blood, and there was a young cavalry commander who disobeyed a direct order from his own general in the middle of the fight. That one act of defiance, that single moment of rebellion, saved an entire civilization from being wiped off the map. But here is the part no one talks about. The man the poets later called Arthur was never a king. He never wore a crown. He was something far more dangerous. And by the end of this story, you will understand why the legend had to be invented, because the truth was too raw, too human, too desperate for the poets to leave it alone. To understand what happened on that hill, you need to understand what Britain looked like before the battle. And what it looked like was a corpse. For nearly 400 years, Rome had ruled Britain. Roman roads connected every major town. Roman walls held back the northern tribes. Roman law kept order. Roman soldiers kept the peace. Then Rome left. The legions pulled out in the early 5th century. The empire was collapsing across Europe. Britain was expendable. The soldiers packed up. The ships sailed south. And an entire island was left to fend for itself. At first, the collapse was slow. Local leaders tried to hold things together. Magistrates still collected taxes. Bishops still held councils. Former military officers organized local militias. They wrote letters to Rome, begging for help. No help came. The roads cracked. The walls crumbled. The tax system fell apart. The courts dissolved. Within a generation, the structure that had held Britain together for 4 centuries was gone. Now think about what that means for the people living through it. You wake up one morning and the government is gone. The army is gone. The laws that protected you, gone. Your neighbors, the ones you never trusted, they have swords now. And nobody is coming to stop them. That is exactly what happened. Warlords filled the vacuum. Some were former Roman officers clinging to old titles. Others were tribal chieftains who saw opportunity in the chaos. They carved Britain into a patchwork of petty kingdoms. Territories in the west. Strongholds in the north. Crumbling city-states hiding behind Roman walls that nobody knew how to repair. These kings still called themselves Roman. They still spoke Latin in their courts. They still minted coins with imperial symbols, coins that bought less and less with each passing year. They dressed in the costumes of an empire that had already forgotten them. But here is what made everything worse. They could not stop fighting each other. King against king. Clan against clan. Feuds over cattle, over land, over insults spoken at feasts 10 years earlier. While they argued over scraps, something was moving across the North Sea. Something that would make their petty wars look like children's games. The Saxons came first as raiders. Small war bands crossing the water in longships. They hit coastal villages at dawn. Burned what they could not carry. Took slaves. Took gold. Then vanished back across the sea before anyone could respond. The British kings treated these raids as a nuisance. A seasonal problem. Like storms or bad harvests, unpleasant but manageable. They were wrong. As the 5th century deepened, the raids changed. The warbands grew larger. They stayed longer. They stopped retreating. And then something shifted that the British kings had not expected. The raiders brought their families. Whole tribes crossed the North Sea. Men, women, children, cattle and tools. Gods carved in wood and strapped to the prows of their ships. These were not raiders anymore. These were settlers. They came from what is now Germany and Denmark, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and they were looking for land. Not to visit. To keep. They settled the eastern shores first. Then pushed inland. Every mile they claimed was a mile the Britons lost. And they did not lose it temporarily. They lost it forever. The Saxon settlements became Saxon kingdoms. Kent in the southeast. Sussex along the southern coast. Essex in the east. These territories, carved from British land, would one day become the foundations of England itself. But in the 5th century, they were open wounds on the body of a dying nation. If you are still here, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because what happened next, the decision one British commander made when his back was against the wall, is the moment this story catches fire. The Saxons burned churches and raised timber halls on the ashes. They worshipped Woden, the god of war. Thunor, the god of thunder. They had no interest in Roman law, Roman roads, or the Christian faith. They brought their own gods, their own language, their own way of life. And they brought something else: momentum. Every year, more Saxons crossed the water. Every year, the British kingdoms shrank. The Latin-speaking landowners in the east were dead, enslaved, or they had fled west with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of everything they had lost. But here is the detail that changes everything. The British kings could have stopped this. They had the numbers. They had Roman-trained cavalry. They had fortified towns and disciplined infantry. On paper, they should have crushed the Saxon advance before it reached the Midlands. They did not. Because they refused to unite. King fought king while the Saxons pushed deeper. Rivalries over land. Arguments over religion. Disputes over old Roman titles that meant nothing anymore. The Britons were bleeding out, and half of them were holding the knife. By the last decades of the 5th century, the eastern half of Britain was gone. The Saxon kingdoms controlled territory from the Channel coast to the river valleys of the interior. Their war chiefs were no longer raiding for plunder. They were planning a final push, one massive, coordinated invasion that would sweep westward and finish what 50 years of migration had started. The question was no longer whether the Saxons would conquer all of Britain. The question was whether anything on earth could stop them. One man believed he had the answer. He was old. He was tired. He had spent a decade trying to hold together an alliance of kings who would rather fight each other than face the real enemy. His name was Ambrosius. And he had just found a hill. But Ambrosius had something the Saxons had not accounted for. A weapon they had never faced. A young cavalry commander with Roman training, British blood, and a reputation that was spreading across the western kingdoms like fire through dry grass. The soldiers called him the Bear. The poets would later call him Arthur. And the Saxons would learn his name the hard way. Ambrosius stood on a hilltop in the western reaches of Britain. Below him, a valley was burning. The village had been there that morning. 40 families. Stone houses with thatched roofs. A small church. A market square where farmers traded wool for iron tools. By noon, it was ash. The Saxons had come at dawn. 300 warriors. They emerged from the tree line with axes catching the first light. The villagers never had a chance. The ones who ran were cut down in the fields. The ones who hid were dragged from cellars and killed in the open. The ones who fought, and a few did fight, died on their doorsteps with kitchen knives in their hands. By the time Ambrosius received word, it was over. The Saxons took what they could carry, burned the rest, then marched east, back toward their own territory. The same pattern they had followed for decades. Ambrosius watched the smoke climb into a gray sky and said nothing for a long time. He was 53 years old. He looked older. His hair had gone white in the decade since he had taken command of British resistance. His hands, once steady enough to throw a javelin through a Saxon shield at 30 paces, now trembled when he raised his cup. His back ached in the mornings. His knees ached at night. His body was failing him one joint at a time. But his mind was sharper than it had ever been. And his mind was telling him something his body did not want to hear. The pattern was changing. Behind him, his war council waited. If you could call it a war council. It was more like a room full of men who hated each other but hated dying more. Petty kings from the western highlands. Tribal chieftains who claimed royal blood going back 1,000 years. Former Roman officers whose uniforms had rotted off their backs a generation ago. They had fought each other over cattle raids, over border disputes, over insults at feasts that nobody else remembered. Now they sat in a circle on a hilltop and stared at the smoke below. None of them spoke first. None of them wanted to be the one to say what everyone was thinking. So Ambrosius said it for them. The raids are getting larger. His voice was calm, almost flat, like a man describing the weather. 300 warriors today. 500 last month at the river crossing near Glevum. 800 at the coast in the spring. He paused. Let the numbers settle. They are not raiding anymore. They are testing us. Probing our defenses. Counting our response times. Learning where we are strong and where we are weak. Cader, king of a small southwestern realm, shifted on his seat. He was a thick man. Broad shoulders. Warrior's scars on his arms and face. But his eyes were a politician's eyes, always calculating, always measuring who had power and who did not. What are you saying, Lord? Ambrosius turned to face them. His gaze moved from one face to the next. He read them the way a general reads a battlefield. The fear here, the doubt there, the pride that would not bend, the desperation hiding behind crossed arms and hard jaws. I am saying they are coming. Not in bands of hundreds. In thousands. Every Saxon kingdom east of the Midlands is gathering its war bands. Kent. Sussex. Essex. They are done raiding. They want the rest of the island. And they mean to take it in one push. Silence. But here is what you need to understand about this moment. Ambrosius was not guessing. He had spent 10 years studying Saxon war patterns. He had spies in the Eastern Territories, British survivors who had been enslaved but still found ways to send information west. He knew the Saxon chiefs by name. He knew their rivalries. He knew their ambitions. And he knew that for the first time in 50 years, those rivalries had stopped mattering. The Saxon kings had found something they wanted more than they wanted to fight each other. They wanted Britain. All of it. What do you propose? The voice came from the back of the circle. Cadwallon, a young northern king. His father had died fighting Saxons 20 years earlier. He had inherited a kingdom the size of a large farm and an anger that had not cooled since childhood. Ambrosius let the question hang for 3 heartbeats. Then he answered. I propose that we stop running. Every man in that circle went still. For 40 years, we have retreated. We have traded land for time. We have told ourselves that someday the tide would turn, that Rome would come back, that the Saxons would collapse from within. that God would intervene. His voice hardened. Not louder, harder, like iron cooling in water. None of that happened. None of it is going to happen. We are alone. And we are running out of land to trade. He looked at Cader, at Cadwallon, at the scarred faces and clenched fists around the circle. I propose we choose our ground, fortify it, and make the Saxons come to us. Give them the battle they want, and make them pay a price they cannot afford. Cader's jaw tightened. Where? There is a hill. The old people called it Badon. It commands every eastern approach to the western kingdoms. Steep slopes, ancient earthworks on the summit, ground where cavalry can maneuver and infantry can hold a line. He paused again. Let them see it in their minds. If we hold Badon, the Saxons cannot march west without leaving a British army in their rear. They will have to take the hill or abandon the invasion. And I intend to make taking it the most expensive thing they have ever attempted. But here is the part no one in that circle knew yet. Ambrosius had a weapon the Saxons had never faced in a set-piece battle. A weapon that would turn the entire fight on its head. And he was about to hand it to a 29-year-old with a broken nose and a reputation for doing things his own way. Artorius was not what you would expect. If you have grown up with the legend, the Golden King in shining armor, the noble ruler of Camelot, the real man would shock you. He was not yet 30. His face was a map of old fights, scars across his cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least twice and never set properly. He was built like a wrestler, low to the ground, thick through the shoulders and arms. He was not tall. He was not handsome. He was not the kind of man who walked into a room and turned heads. He was the kind of man who walked onto a battlefield and changed the outcome. His father had been a Roman cavalry officer, one of the last. His mother was British, daughter of a Western king. From his father, Artorius inherited an understanding of Roman tactics that most British commanders had long since forgotten. The value of formation. The power of a coordinated cavalry charge. The discipline to hold a position when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to move. From his mother, he inherited something else entirely. Pride. The fierce, burning pride of a people who had been conquered by Rome, had outlasted Rome, and were not about to be erased by Saxons. He commanded 300 mounted warriors. That is a small number. You could fit them in a modern parking garage. But these were not ordinary fighters. They were the last remnant of the Roman auxiliary cavalry tradition. They rode smaller horses than the war horses of later centuries. But those horses were battle-trained, accustomed to the screams of dying men, accustomed to blood underfoot. The riders carried long spears and Celtic swords. They wore whatever armor they had inherited or captured, chain mail shirts, hardened leather, dented helmets. They drilled every day. They fought as a unit. And they could hit a stationary enemy formation with the force of a landslide. The soldiers called Artorius the Bear. Partly for his strength. Partly for the emblem on his shield. Partly because once he got his teeth into a fight, he did not let go. Ambrosius watched him drilling the cavalry on the lower slopes of Badon. 300 riders moving in perfect formation. Spears leveled. Hooves shaking the ground. The thunder reached the summit like distant war drums. And for the first time in years, Ambrosius felt something shift in his chest. Something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. He is the future. The voice came from behind. Ambrosius did not turn. He already knew who it was. Murden appeared and disappeared like weather. A counselor. a healer, an old man who claimed to see things others could not. Some called him a prophet. Others called him a fraud. Ambrosius called him the only honest man in Britain. "If there is a future," Ambrosius replied, "there is always a future, Lord. The question is who will be alive to see it." The two men stood side by side. Below them, fires were being lit for the evening meal. The smell of roasting meat drifted up the slope, mixed with grass and earth and the first hint of rain on the wind. The army was settling in. Thousands of men from dozens of kingdoms, sleeping under the same sky for the first time. "The Saxons will come soon," Murden said. "Yes. They outnumber us." "Yes. Many of these men will not survive." Ambrosius did not answer immediately. He was watching Artorius lead one final charge across the meadow. The cavalry moved like a single creature, 300 riders turning as one, their spears catching the last light of the sun. "Perhaps," Ambrosius said finally, "but not all of them. And the ones who survive will remember. They will tell their children. And their children will tell their children. And someday, when every man standing on this hill is dust, the memory of what happened here will remain." He turned to face Murden. His eyes held something that was not quite hope, not quite faith. Something older than both. "That is what we fight for. Not victory. Memory. The knowledge that Britain did not die without a fight." Murden studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "And if we win?" Ambrosius smiled. A real smile. The first one anyone had seen from him in months. "Then the memory will be even better." If this story is already pulling you in, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm to push this to more people who care about real history. And trust me, what happens next on that hill is the part that will keep you up tonight. But here is what Ambrosius did not tell Murden. What he did not tell anyone. His plan depended on one thing above all else. Discipline. The cavalry had to stay hidden behind the summit until exactly the right moment. Too early, and the Saxons would see them coming and form a defense. Too late, and the infantry would be dead before the horses could charge. The timing had to be perfect. And perfect timing required absolute obedience. Ambrosius had given Artorius one order. One clear, unbreakable command. "Hold the cavalry in reserve. Do not move until I give the signal. No matter what you see. No matter what you hear. No matter how badly the line is breaking. Wait for my command." Artorius had looked him in the eye, and agreed. But Ambrosius had seen something in the young commander's face that worried him. A flicker behind the obedience. A heat that discipline could contain but never fully control. The same fire that made Artorius brilliant on a battlefield also made him dangerous. Because men like Artorius did not wait well. They saw the moment. They seized it. And they did not ask permission first. Ambrosius knew this. He was counting on it. And he was terrified of it. Because if Artorius moved too soon, the cavalry would be wasted. The infantry would die unsupported. The hill would fall. And Britain, everything British, would fall with it. The entire fate of an island rested on whether a 29-year-old with a broken nose could control himself long enough to let the plan work. The Saxons were 3 days away. The cavalry was ready. The infantry was dug in. The stakes were sharpened. The archers were positioned. Everything was set. Everything was in place. And Ambrosius could not sleep. Because he knew, the way old commanders always know, that no plan survives contact with the enemy. and the variable he could not control was not the Saxons. It was the bear. The Saxon army arrived on a morning heavy with mist. They did not march in a single column. They spilled across the valley like floodwater. Thousands of warriors spreading through the lowlands below the hill. Shield after shield after shield. Painted with wolves. Painted with ravens. Painted with runes that promised their gods were watching. War horns sounded across the landscape. Deep. Mournful. The kind of sound you feel in your ribs before you hear it in your ears. The horns were answered by the clash of axes on shields. Hundreds of Saxon warriors beating a rhythm that rolled up the hillside like thunder from the ground itself. The Britons on the summit watched in silence. There was nothing to say. Every man could count. Every man could see what was standing at the base of their hill. The Saxon host filled the valley from tree line to tree line. An ocean of iron and leather and killing intent. Artorius stood beside Ambrosius at the edge of the earthworks. His hand rested on his sword hilt. His jaw was locked. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the enemy formation, reading their disposition, counting their war bands the way a farmer counts a coming storm. "They mean to surround us," he said quietly. "Cut off retreat. Starve us out." "Yes," Ambrosius agreed. "That is what I would do in their place." "How long can we hold with what we have?" 2 weeks. Perhaps less. "And if they assault before that?" Ambrosius gestured toward the slopes. The steep approaches, the ancient earthworks, the rows of sharpened stakes his engineers had driven into the ground at killing angles. "Then they will pay for every step they climb. But if they are patient—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The Saxons made camp that afternoon. And they did it with a discipline that would have surprised anyone who thought of them as mindless raiders. Tents went up in orderly rows. Perimeters were marked. Sentries were posted. These were not scattered warbands stumbling through foreign territory. These were organized military units under unified command. The Saxon war chiefs understood siegecraft. They had learned it from decades of attacking Roman forts. They knew how to surround a position, how to cut supply lines, how to wait. Then came the provocation. Cattle were slaughtered at the base of the hill, in full view of the British defenders above. The Saxons roasted the meat over enormous fires. The smell drifted up the slope on the evening wind. Rich, heavy, deliberate. The Britons on the summit were rationing dried grain and stale water. Every man on that hilltop smelled the roasting meat. Every man felt his stomach tighten. Every man understood the message the Saxons were sending. "We have food. We have time. How long do you?" But the smell was not the worst part. The worst part came after dark. The drums started at nightfall. A slow, steady beat. One drum at first. Then another. Then a dozen. The rhythm was simple, so simple it burrowed into your skull and refused to leave. It did not speed up. It did not slow down. It just continued. Beat after beat after beat. Hour after hour. The sound seemed to come from the earth itself. It vibrated through the ground, through the timber of the palisade walls, through the bones of every man lying on the cold hilltop trying to sleep. No one slept. Men jerked awake reaching for weapons. Not because of an attack. Because the rhythm tricked their bodies into thinking one was coming. The drums never promised violence. They promised something worse. The endless grinding wait for violence that had not arrived yet. This was not a military tactic. This was psychological destruction. The Saxons were not trying to breach the wall that night. They were trying to break the mines behind it. But here is what the Saxons did not account for. The Britons had their own weapon against the dark. Hymns rose from the summit. Christian voices lifting Latin words into the night sky. Old prayers. Old songs. The kind of music that does not drown out fear but sits beside it. Holds its hand. Refuses to let go. Some men made confession to the priests who had marched with the army. They knelt on cold earth and whispered the things they had done and the things they were afraid of. The priests listened. Offered absolution. Offered no promises about tomorrow. Others sat alone. Staring at the Saxon fires below. Counting the lights. Doing the math that soldiers always do before a battle. How many of them against how many of us? The math never came out right. Ambrosius did not sleep either. He walked the perimeter all night. Moving from post to post. Speaking to sentries in a low voice. Checking positions. Adjusting stakes. Laying a hand on the shoulder of a young spearman whose hands would not stop shaking. He had learned this from a Roman centurion 30 years before. The commander who shows his face in the dark tells his men something no speech can say. I am here. I am not hiding. I am not afraid. Even if all three of those things were lies, the act itself was enough. Ambrosius was afraid. He just could not afford to show it. He found Artorius at midnight. The young cavalry commander was standing alone at the eastern edge of the earthworks, staring down at the Saxon camp. The firelight below cast his face in orange and shadow. The drums pulsed in the distance. Neither man acknowledged them anymore. The sound had become part of the air. "You should sleep," Ambrosius said. "I cannot." Ambrosius leaned against the earthwork wall beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Two men watching an army that wanted to kill them. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of men who have said everything that small talk can carry, and have arrived at the place where only truth fits. Artorius broke it first. "I keep thinking about what happens if we fail." "If we fail, we die," Ambrosius said. "There is nothing complicated about it. I was not thinking about dying." His voice dropped, almost too quiet to hear above the drums. "I was thinking about what comes after. The villages that burn. The people who get dragged into slavery. The language, our language, forgotten within a generation. The churches torn down. The names of our fathers erased. Everything we were, gone. Like it never existed." He turned. In the moonlight, his eyes held something that Ambrosius had never seen there before. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. "I am not afraid of death, Lord. I am afraid of meaning nothing. Of fighting and bleeding and dying on this hill, and history not even remembering we were here." Ambrosius studied the young man's face for a long time. The drums beat on. The fires below flickered. A cold wind moved across the summit carrying the smell of Saxon cook fires and the faint scent of rain. Then Ambrosius placed his hand on Artorius's shoulder. "Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago," he said quietly. "History does not remember most of us. The legions that built the roads on this island, their names are gone. The engineers who raised the walls, forgotten. The farmers who fed the empire for 400 years, dust. They lived. They died. The world continued without them." He paused, choosing his words the way a swordsmith chooses where to strike heated iron. But sometimes, rarely, a moment comes when ordinary men can do something extraordinary. when the full weight of history balances on a single point. One battle, one decision, one act of courage. And what happens in that moment tips everything, one direction or the other. He gestured toward the fires below. This is that moment. If we break tomorrow, Britain falls. Maybe not immediately, but inevitably. The tide will sweep west and nothing will stop it. But if we hold, if we bleed and fight and somehow drive them back, we buy time. A generation. Maybe more. Time for children to grow up speaking our language. Time for the faith to take deeper root. Time for something new to grow from what we were. He squeezed Artorius's shoulder. That is what we fight for. Not glory. Not victory. Time. The kind of time that lets seeds become forests. Artorius was silent for a long moment. The drums filled the space between them. Below, a Saxon war horn moaned once and fell quiet. And if we are remembered? Artorius asked. Ambrosius smiled. A real one. Small and tired but real. Then may the poets be kind to us. They stood together a while longer. Two men on the edge of everything. Then Artorius straightened, nodded once, walked back toward the cavalry lines where 300 riders were waiting for an order that had not come yet. Ambrosius watched him go, and the thing he had felt earlier, the hope, flickered again. Fragile, uncertain, like a candle flame in a room full of open windows. He turned back to the valley. The drums had not stopped. The fires had not dimmed. The Saxon army was still there, still waiting, still confident. Dawn was 4 hours away, and when it came, it would bring the sound every man on that summit had been dreading, the rhythmic clash of axes on shields, the war chant of 1,000 Saxon warriors working themselves into a killing fury. The first assault was coming, and it would hit them like nothing they had ever survived. Dawn came gray and cold. Mist clung to the valley floor like a burial shroud. The drums had stopped sometime before first light. The silence that replaced them was worse, because silence meant the Saxons were done waiting. Every British defender on that summit knew what was coming. They had checked their weapons in the dark, tightened straps on borrowed armor, said prayers they were not sure anyone was listening to. Now they stood at their positions behind the earthworks and the timber walls and the rows of sharpened stakes, and they waited for the sound. It came from the mist. The rhythmic clash of axes on shields. Slow at first, then faster, building like a heartbeat accelerating toward something violent. Then the voices joined. Hundreds of Saxon warriors chanting in unison. A deep, guttural roar that rolled up the hillside and pressed against the chest of every man standing behind the wall. The sound grew louder, closer, until the ground itself seemed to vibrate with it. Then the first wave emerged from the fog. They came in loose shield walls. Not the tight formations of Roman infantry. These were war bands. Groups of 30 or 40 warriors bound by oaths to their chiefs. Each man fighting for glory and plunder and the promise of land. Axes and spears bristled above painted shields. Wolf pelts hung from shoulders. Iron helmets caught what little light the gray morning offered. They climbed the slope with a confidence that came from 50 years of victory. They had burned British towns, toppled British kings, shattered every army that had tried to stop them. One more hill, one more ridge, one more British warlord. What difference could it make? The British archers answered that question first. The opening volley launched while the Saxons were still 100 paces out. Arrows arced through the morning air, dark lines against gray sky, and fell among the advancing warriors. Men stumbled. Shields came up too late. Shafts punched through leather, through wool, through flesh and bone. The front ranks faltered, but they did not break. Those behind stepped over the fallen and kept climbing. A second volley took more of them. A third took fewer. Arrows were precious and the archers could not waste them on distant targets. They shifted positions along the earthworks. Waited for closer range. Waited for gaps between shields where a well-aimed shaft could end a life. The Saxons hit the stakes. Sharpened timber driven into the earth at killing angles. Designed to break a charge. Designed to slow anyone careful enough to pick through them. Warriors hacked at the obstacles with axes. Shields held overhead against the rain of stones and arrows from above. Some made it through. Many did not. Bodies piled at the base of the stakes. The dead became obstacles of their own. Then the survivors reached the wall. The collision shook the hilltop. Saxon axes crashed against British shields. The sound was not the clean ring of metal on metal you hear in stories. It was a wet, heavy crunch, wood splitting, iron biting, bone giving way beneath both. British spears stabbed forward through gaps in the timber wall. Again and again. Finding throats. Bellies. The soft spaces beneath raised arms. The fighting became intimate in a way that no distance battle ever is. Inches separated attacker from defender. Eyes met across the barrier, wide, furious, terrified. Blades found flesh at arm's length. Men screamed. War cries became pain. Defiance became desperation. The smell hit like a physical thing. Blood and sweat and smoke and the wet earth scent of the hillside underneath it all. Men slipped on mud that had turned red. They grabbed the wall to stay upright and stabbed at anything that moved on the other side. Artorius watched from the summit. His cavalry drawn up in reserve behind the crest. Hidden from Saxon eyes. His hands gripped his reins so hard the leather creased beneath his knuckles. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the violence, wanting to move. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to charge. To lead 300 riders down the slope and scatter the attackers like dust in a gale. But the order was clear. Wait. Hold. Do not move until the signal comes. He stayed. The infantry held. Yard by bloody yard, they held. When a man fell, another stepped into his place. When a section buckled, reserves rushed to fill the gap. These were not professional soldiers. These were farmers and herdsmen and blacksmiths who had picked up weapons because there was nobody else to pick them up. They fought with the grim efficiency of men who understood one simple truth: if this line breaks, everyone behind it dies. An hour passed. 2 hours. The Saxons threw themselves against the defenses with relentless fury. But the math of the hill worked against them. The slope exhausted them before they reached the stakes. The stakes slowed them enough for the archers to find targets. The archers thinned them enough for the infantry to hold. By mid-morning, the first assault was over. The Saxons pulled back down the slope. They left hundreds of their dead behind, draped over stakes, crumpled at the base of the wall, sprawled across the hillside in broken shapes that no longer looked like men. The drums in the valley fell silent. Ambrosius walked the defensive line, stepping over bodies. British and Saxon tangled together in death the way they had been tangled in combat. The butcher's bill was steep, nearly 200 defenders dead or wounded. A toll the army could not absorb many more times. But the wall stood. The stakes stood. The line had held. He found Bedwer, his infantry commander, sitting against an earthen bank with blood running from a gash above his eye. A grizzled man. Old scars layered over older ones. The kind of soldier who measured his life in fights survived rather than years lived. How bad? Ambrosius asked. Bedwyr shrugged. We can hold one more like that. Maybe two. After that. He drew a finger across his throat. Then we make sure there is no third assault. And how do we manage that, Lord? Ambrosius glanced toward the summit. Toward the crest where Artorius sat motionless on his horse. Still waiting. Still holding. When the time is right, Ambrosius said quietly, we stop defending. The second assault hit the following morning. And it nearly ended everything. The Saxons had learned from the first attack. This time they did not come from one direction. They came from all of them. War bands climbing the eastern slope. Others pushing up from the south. Others from the west. All at once. All simultaneously. The British defenders, already thinned from the first assault, had to spread across the entire perimeter. Archers who had covered one approach now had to cover three. Spearmen who had fought shoulder to shoulder now stood with gaps between them wide enough for a man to walk through. On the western slope, a Saxon chieftain named El led his warriors through a section of stakes that had been damaged the day before. His men poured through the gap like water through a cracked dam. Axes swinging. Shields battering aside spears. British defenders falling back. Bedwyr saw the breach and charged into it with his reserves. The fighting collapsed into something that was not combat anymore. It was butchery at arm's length. Knives when swords were lost. Fists when knives were dropped. Men died in heaps. Trampled by their own side. Choking on blood-soaked mud. Bedwyr's sword found El's throat. The Saxon chieftain dropped. But in the same moment, a Saxon axe caught Bedwyr in the shoulder. The blade bit through leather and flesh. He went down beside the man he had killed. El's death broke the western assault. The Saxons who had pushed through found themselves cut off. Surrounded. British blades found them from every angle. The breakthrough became a killing pocket. But the eastern slope was collapsing. A Saxon warband, the largest yet, had reached the summit itself. They were through the stakes. Through the wall. Standing on British ground for the first time. Howling triumph. Axes carving into the defenders from behind. The British line buckled inward. Men falling faster than they could be replaced. Artorius saw it happening. He saw the line bowing. He saw the gap widening. He saw British defenders turning to run, the first time any of them had broken, and he saw what would happen in the next 60 seconds if nothing changed. The summit would fall. The army would shatter. Britain would die on this hill. The order was to wait for the signal. Ambrosius had been clear. Absolute. Do not move until I give the command. No signal came. Artorius did not wait. Mount up. His voice cut through the noise like a blade through cloth. 300 riders surged forward. Horses lunging from standstill to gallop in 3 strides. Spears dropping level. Shields braced. The thunder of hooves drowning out the screaming. They hit the Saxon breakthrough at full speed. The impact was not a collision. It was an erasure. Horses slammed into warriors who had no formation to absorb a cavalry charge. Spears punched through shields that had been raised against infantry, not against 1,000 pounds of armored horse moving at 30 miles an hour. Men were thrown backward. Trampled, crushed beneath hooves. Artorius was in the center of it. his sword rising and falling in a rhythm that had nothing to do with thought. There was no thought. There was only the next blow, the next target, the next Saxon face appearing in front of him and disappearing in a spray of red. The cavalry wheeled and struck again, driving the survivors back toward the edge of the summit. British infantry reformed behind them, shields locking, spears leveling, and together they pushed. Back to the earthworks. Back to the stakes. Back down the slope. The second assault broke. But Artorius did not stop. He looked down the hillside. He saw the Saxons below, scattered, disorganized, their chiefs dead or missing. War bands that had climbed with songs on their lips were now stumbling back in confusion. No formation. No leadership. No plan. He saw the moment. The one Ambrosius had talked about on the night before. The knife's edge. The tipping point. He raised his sword and screamed one word. Forward. The cavalry poured down the slope. They caught the retreating Saxons in the open ground below the hill. Warriors who had thrown away shields and weapons to run faster. The killing was methodical. Relentless. Lances in backs. Swords across necks. Horses over the stumbling and the fallen. British infantry followed. In formation. Disciplined. Finishing every Saxon who tried to turn and fight. They moved through the enemy camp, overturning tents, scattering fires, cutting down those who had not fled. Saxon chiefs tried to rally. A few planted their standards in the earth, raised axes, and roared defiance. Small knots of warriors gathered around them. Last stands in the middle of a collapsing army. British cavalry crashed into these pockets with the efficiency of men who had trained for exactly this moment. Horses reared. Lances found exposed backs. Swords rose and fell until the standards toppled and the chiefs lay face down in the dirt. The rout became a destruction. Saxon warriors ran for the tree line, for the river, for anywhere that was not here. The cavalry hunted them through the valley, killing stragglers, breaking scattered bands, driving the survivors so far from the hill that they would not regroup for years. By late afternoon, the valley belonged to Britain. The Saxon army, the force that was supposed to finish British resistance forever, was broken, dead, scattered, gone. The drums were silent. The war horns were dead. The fires were ashes. All that remained was the hill, and the men who had held it. If this story has you locked in right now, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe if you have not already. Because what comes next, the aftermath, is the part that stays with you long after the battle is over. The sun set over Badon in shades of red and gold. The colors should have been beautiful. They were not. They looked too much like the hillside. Too much like the valley below. Too much like the field where bodies lay in heaps so thick that the ground beneath them had disappeared. Ambrosius walked among the dead. Slowly. Carefully. Stepping between British and Saxon bodies that had fallen so close together you could not tell who had killed whom. The fighting had ended hours ago, but the field still held the smell of it, iron and sweat and the terrible sweetness that comes when wounds sit open in the afternoon heat. Crows had already begun to circle, patient, unhurried. They had seen this before. They would see it again. He found Artorius near the base of the hill. The young commander had dismounted. He was standing beside his horse, running his hands along its flanks, checking for wounds with the quiet focus of a man who needed something ordinary to do. His armor was slicked with blood, none of it his own. His sword was still in his hand. His face showed nothing. Around him, The surviving cavalry sat on exhausted horses. Their spears were broken or missing. Their shields were cracked. Their faces carried the blank expression of men who had done something enormous and had not yet figured out how to feel about it. Ambrosius stopped 3 paces away. "You disobeyed orders." Artorius did not look up. "I did. I told you to wait for my command. I was clear. I was specific." "Yes. You charged without authorization. You pursued without support. You risked 300 cavalry, our only cavalry, on a decision you made alone in the middle of a fight." Artorius finally raised his eyes. There was no defiance in them. No pride. Just exhaustion so deep it had become its own kind of emptiness. "I saw the line breaking," he said quietly. "If I had waited for your signal, there would have been nothing left to save." Ambrosius stared at him. The silence stretched between them. The crows called overhead. A horse stamped somewhere behind them. The last light of the sun touched the hilltop and turned the earthworks to gold. Then Ambrosius smiled. Not the cold, thin smile of a commander measuring a subordinate. A real smile. Tired. Cracked at the edges. But real. "You did well," he said. "Better than well. You saved us." He stepped forward and gripped Artorius by the arm. Pulled him into an embrace that surprised them both. The old commander and the young cavalry officer. Standing in the middle of a field of dead men. Holding on to each other because there was nothing else solid enough to hold. When they separated, Artorius asked the question that the dead deserved an answer to. "What did we accomplish? What was the point of all this blood?" Ambrosius did not answer immediately. He looked at the hillside, the broken stakes, the shattered wall, the bodies that would take days to bury. He looked at the valley, the overturned Saxon camp, the scattered fires, the weapons abandoned by men who had run and would not stop running for weeks. Then he looked west. Toward the lands the Saxons had been trying to reach. The kingdoms that still spoke British. The churches that still stood. The children who were sleeping tonight in homes that would still be standing tomorrow because of what had happened on this hill. "Time," he said. "We bought time. A generation. Maybe more." He turned back to Artorius. "Time for children to grow up speaking our language. Time for the faith to take deeper root. Time for the memory of what we were to pass from parent to child." He gestured toward the summit. British soldiers were already digging graves up there. Working in the fading light. Laying their comrades in the earth with whatever care exhausted hands could manage. They will remember this. They will tell their sons about the day Britain stopped running. The day the tide turned. And when the stories are told, something will survive. Not us, but something of us. Our courage. Our refusal. The knowledge that we did not accept our fate without a fight. He held Artorius's gaze. "That is what we accomplished. We gave Britain a memory to live by." Ambrosius was right. But he could not have known how right. The Saxon advance stopped after Badon. Not forever. Nothing stops forever. But for nearly 50 years, the Western kingdoms lived in relative peace. Children grew up without knowing the sound of Saxon war horns. Farms were rebuilt. Churches were restored. Towns that had been abandoned filled with people again. 50 years. One battle bought 50 years. Ambrosius died 15 years after Badon. Peacefully. In his bed. A rare death for a man who had spent his entire life at war. The kings he had united wept at his funeral, even the ones who had hated him. But the story does not end with Ambrosius. Artorius kept fighting. For 30 more years. Victory after victory. Raid after raid turned back. Saxon warbands that tested the western borders learned the same lesson every time: the bear was still alive. And the bear did not lose. His name spread across the British territories until it became something larger than any single man. Artorius was not just a commander anymore. He was a symbol. A promise. Proof that the Saxons could be beaten. He never married. Never fathered children that history recorded. He died in battle at a place the old chronicles call Camlan. No one knows where it was. No one knows exactly what happened. Only that he fell, and that when he fell, something in Britain fell with him. But here is the part that matters most. The part that turns a dead cavalry commander into the most famous legend in the Western world. The poets got hold of the story. It did not happen immediately. Decades passed. Then centuries. The men who had fought at Badon died. Their sons died. Their grandsons forgot the details and remembered only the feeling, the pride, the defiance, the impossible victory. And into that gap between memory and forgetting, the poets stepped. They took Artorius and gave him a crown he never wore. They called him Arthur. They gave him a magical sword pulled from a stone, because the truth, that he carried a battered Roman cavalry blade, was not dramatic enough. They gave him a wizard named Merlin, because the real Murden, the old counselor who stood beside Ambrosius, was too ordinary for legend. They gave him a round table and a court of noble knights, because the real war council, a circle of petty kings who could barely stand each other, did not fit the story they wanted to tell. They turned a desperate last stand into a golden age. They turned a mud-soaked hilltop into a shining castle. They turned a broken-nosed cavalry officer into the greatest king Britain never had. But beneath every layer of legend, beneath the magic and the romance and the fairy tale endings, the truth remained. A band of outnumbered Britons held a hill against an army that should have swept them away. They had no enchanted weapons, no divine intervention, no guarantee they would survive the morning. They had swords and spears and shields and the absolute refusal to accept that their story was over. They broke an invasion. They bought their people time. They gave a dying civilization one more generation to breathe. The chroniclers who wrote about Badon disagree on almost everything. The monk Gildas, writing decades later, mentions the victory but never names the leader. The Welsh chronicler Nennius, writing centuries after, calls him Arthur and gives him 12 battles. The details blur. The dates shift. The location of the hill itself is lost. But they all agree on one thing. At Badon, the Britons won. And the Saxons fled. The hill fell silent after the battle. The survivors buried their dead in graves that would be forgotten within a generation. The blood soaked into the earth. Grass grew over it the following spring. Wildflowers grew the spring after that. But the memory did not fade the way the graves did. It lived in songs sung by firelight, in stories passed from parent to child, in the stubborn, unbreakable pride of a people who had been pushed to the edge of extinction, and pushed back. It became Arthur. It became Camelot. It became a legend that has survived 1,500 years and shows no sign of dying. But before it was any of those things, before the poets and the storytellers and the mythmakers got their hands on it, it was simply this: a hill, a battle, and a handful of men who would not run. If this story changed how you see King Arthur, or what a single battle can mean, leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. And subscribe to Dark History Untold. Because the stories history tried to bury are the ones that matter most. The gate held. The defenders broke through. And for one rare, fleeting moment in the ruins of Roman Britain, the tide turned. That was enough. That would always be enough.